At dawn on May 12, 1945, in a makeshift field hospital on the island of Okinawa, the air hung heavy with the stench of iodine, burned flesh, and gunpowder. Outside, mortars thudded against ridgelines, rattling the canvas walls, while inside, a single bulb swung overhead, casting shadows over rows of cots. Japanese prisoners, bloodied, skeletal, trembling, lay side by side with wounded Americans, their eyes darting in disbelief at the sight of U.S. Army medics dressing their wounds with the same precision, the same compassion as those of their own men. To the Japanese nurses taken captive just days earlier, it was a vision that defied everything they had been taught. The enemy, the barbaric American, saving Japanese lives with advanced medicine and supplies more abundant than anything they had ever seen. U.S. Army After Action Report. Okinawa, May 1945. For these nurses, trained under imperial doctrine to believe surrender was dishonor and mercy a weakness, the scene was nothing short of surreal. One nurse clutched the edge of a cot as she watched penicillin drip slowly into the arm of a captured soldier who, only days before, had begged to be left behind. The antibiotic, still a miracle drug in 1945, was not yet widely available even to Japanese frontline troops. To see it administered here, on enemy prisoners, was like witnessing sorcery. In their notebooks, they scribbled frantic observations of American techniques, sterile gloves, sulfa powders, morphine injections, blood plasma transfusions, all part of a medical arsenal that Japan could scarcely imagine at this stage of the war. Bundesarchiv. Captured Japanese nurse diary. The sound of scissors snipping bandages cut through the din of artillery. American medics worked quickly, their movements rehearsed, almost mechanical, but tinged with humanity. "We treat them the same," one medic muttered through clenched teeth, wiping sweat from his brow. Wounded is wounded. For the Japanese nurses, raised in a culture where loyalty to the emperor eclipsed compassion for the enemy, the gesture was both shocking and disarming. One nurse, later interrogated, described her reaction as a collapse of certainty. "They fought us as demons, yet healed us as men." U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey. Interrogation Reports, 1946. But how did this moment come to pass? How did American forces possess not only the will, but also the means to heal even their sworn enemies with the same cutting-edge medicine they used on their own? The answer lay in a sweeping transformation of military medicine that had unfolded across the brutal years of World War II. By 1945, the United States had built a medical machine that stretched from pharmaceutical labs in New Jersey to surgical tents on volcanic islands in the Pacific. At its core were advances in antibiotics, blood storage, portable surgery, and evacuation logistics that dwarfed anything the Japanese military could field. U.S. Army Medical Department History. Volume 4. At the outbreak of war in 1939, medicine on the battlefield still looked much like it had in the First World War. Wounds often meant slow death from infection. Pneumonia, septicemia, and gangrene were as deadly as bullets. Japan's medical services, though disciplined and deeply committed, faced constant shortages of drugs, sterile supplies, and trained personnel. Even before the war turned against them, Japanese doctors struggled to keep up with tropical diseases like malaria and dysentery that ravaged their ranks in the jungles of New Guinea and Burma. Japanese Army Medical Bureau Report. 1942. In contrast, the United States, harnessing its vast industrial and scientific base, unleashed a revolution. Penicillin, first mass-produced by Pfizer in deep fermentation tanks, became a wonder drug shipped in crates to both Europe and the Pacific. Pfizer Company Report, 1944. Sulfa drugs, produced in millions of doses, were distributed to every combat medic. Plasma banks, pioneered by Dr. Charles Drew, ensured that wounded soldiers, whether in a Normandy hedgerow or on a coral reef in the Pacific, could receive life-saving transfusions within hours. American Red Cross Blood Program records. 1943. The numbers told the story. By 1945, the U.S. Army had produced over 650 billion units of penicillin, enough to treat both Allied troops and, when needed, captured enemy combatants. U.S. War Production Board Report, 1945. Japanese forces, by comparison, produced penicillin only in small laboratory batches, never at scale, and often resorted to herbal remedies when supplies ran out. For a Japanese nurse, schooled in improvisation and scarcity, the sight of glass vials filled with antibiotics being used freely, even on prisoners, was a revelation that bordered on humiliation. The disparity was not only in medicine itself but also in the philosophy of care. American military doctrine held that every soldier's survival contributed to victory. The faster a man could be patched up and returned to duty, the stronger the force remained. This pragmatism extended even to enemy prisoners, partly for intelligence reasons and partly to uphold Geneva Convention standards. For the Japanese, who saw surrender as dishonorable and prisoners as already dead to the emperor, the logic was incomprehensible. In their worldview, mercy was weakness. In the American tent, it was policy, and it worked out on Okinawa, where more than 12,500 Americans and an estimated 100,000 Japanese soldiers perished. The presence of advanced American medicine shaped not only survival rates, but morale itself. Soldiers spoke of the comfort of knowing medics carried morphine syringes and plasma bottles strapped to their belts. Japanese prisoners whispered among themselves, stunned that their enemy carried into battle not only rifles and grenades, but also syringes and life-saving drugs. U.S. Marine Corps Oral History. 1946. Archival evidence shows that Japanese nurses often wept upon realizing the gap between their nation's resources and America's. One wrote that she could not understand how America had factories for healing as large as our factories for killing. Captured nurse letter, Okinawa, 1945. Another recalled the shock of seeing portable surgical kits unfolded in the mud, complete with sterilizers and scalpels sharper than anything she had touched in Tokyo. This confrontation between belief and reality marked a turning point in their understanding of the war. The Japanese Empire had preached superiority, spiritual resilience, and the divine strength of its people. Yet in the hospital tents of Okinawa, its nurses watched American science and industry save lives they themselves could not have saved with the tools they had been given. It was not bravery alone that kept men alive. It was technology, organization, and an unrelenting commitment to logistics as the war drew to its final, brutal months. These scenes repeated across the Pacific. In Luzon, in Saipan, and in Iwo Jima, Japanese prisoners were shocked to see the enemy share precious medicine, sometimes even before treating their own lightly wounded. For American medics, it was a matter of discipline, of honor, and of efficiency. For the Japanese, it was a dismantling of myth. By the time surrender came in August 1945, Japanese medical personnel who had witnessed American practices carried home stories of shock and awe. They had seen their enemies not only destroy their armies with firepower but also sustain their own with medicine. And, perhaps most disorienting of all, they had seen those same enemies use that medicine on captured Japanese men who, by every cultural measure they had been raised with, deserved only abandonment. The question that haunted them, and that will drive the heart of this story forward, was simple yet profound. What secret power had allowed the Americans to wield medicine as effectively as they wielded rifles? And how had they built a system so vast, so advanced, that even the enemy could not be excluded from its reach? The answer lay not only in battlefield compassion but also in an industrial miracle, a scientific revolution, and a logistical machine unlike anything the world had ever seen. The Japanese nurses had glimpsed the surface of it in those tents. But the full story, the hidden advantage that made such mercy possible, was only beginning to unfold, and when it did, it would reveal why medicine, as much as steel or fire, became one of the decisive weapons of the Second World War. On the morning of March 2, 1945, as American forces closed in on Manila, a convoy of trucks rattled through the rubble-strewn streets, their engines straining under the weight of precious cargo. These were not weapons or ammunition but steel cases filled with vials of penicillin, glass bottles of plasma, morphine syringes, and surgical kits. Within hours, makeshift hospitals sprang up in abandoned schools and churches, transforming ruins into operating theaters. Japanese prisoners, many burned and torn apart by artillery, were laid side by side with American wounded, both hooked to transfusions, both stitched with the same sutures. The stunned Japanese survivors whispered to each other in disbelief. The enemy seemed to conjure medicine from the very earth. Inexhaustible, unstoppable. U.S. Army Medical Department. Manila Field Report, 1945. This was the hidden advantage, an arsenal of science and logistics that the United States had weaponized with devastating effectiveness. Where Japan clung to dwindling supplies and superstition, America had harnessed its industrial heartland to wage war not only with steel but also with healing. Penicillin stood at the center of this revolution. Discovered by Alexander Fleming in 1928, but only mass-produced in wartime, the drug transformed battlefield medicine. In 1941, the United States had just enough to treat a handful of patients. By 1944, thanks to companies like Pfizer, Merck, and Squibb, American factories were churning out 1.6 million doses per month. By war's end, more than 650 billion units had been manufactured, enough to treat every Allied soldier and still spare some for enemy wounded. Technical Manual TM 8 to 255. 1945, penicillin was only the beginning. Sulfonamide powders, developed in the 1930s, became standard issue in every medic's kit. Sprinkled directly onto wounds, they slashed infection rates. Morphine syrettes, small, disposable tubes, delivered fast relief from agony in the field. Perhaps most transformative was blood plasma. Traditional whole blood spoiled quickly, especially in the tropics, but plasma could be dried, stored, and reconstituted anywhere. The American Red Cross, under Dr. Charles Drew's pioneering system, created vast plasma banks, ensuring that soldiers on Iwo Jima or Leyte Gulf could receive transfusions within hours. American Red Cross Blood Bank Report. 1944. To the Japanese, who often resorted to boiling water for sterilization and rationing meager supplies of antiseptic, the American kits seemed like treasures from another world. One captured Japanese nurse in the Philippines later recalled her shock at seeing medics unpack portable sterilizers and collapsible stretchers. We could not believe how many instruments they carried, and how clean. It was as if they had prepared for every wound before the battle began. Captured nurse interrogation, Manila, 1946. Factories across the United States made this possible. At the Detroit Arsenal, machines that once stamped out automobile parts now produced surgical clamps. At Johnson & Johnson plants, assembly lines filled with women in white coats packaged gauze and bandages by the ton. General Electric turned out sterilizers, while smaller firms crafted specialized syringes and plasma bottles. This convergence of science and industry gave American medics a toolkit that seemed limitless. To the Japanese, whose wartime production was crippled by Allied bombing and resource shortages, the gap was devastating. U.S. War Production Board Medical Supply Report. 1944. The test of these innovations came in brutal theaters of combat. One of the clearest demonstrations unfolded during the Battle of Leyte in October 1944. On October 23, as Japanese artillery pounded American positions, the 77th Infantry Division reported over 600 wounded in a single day. Yet within hours, mobile surgical hospitals, MASH units, as they came to be known, were operational. Surgeons worked 20-hour shifts, lit by generators, performing amputations and thoracic surgeries in canvas tents. Plasma flowed freely. Penicillin was administered in cycles. Of the 600 casualties that day, nearly 500 survived. By comparison, Japanese divisions fighting on Leyte suffered catastrophic infection rates, with field diaries noting that wounds became black within days, and men begged for death. Japanese 1st Division Field Diary. 1944. Every paragraph of that battle's records carries the stark contrast. American after-action reports noted infection rates dropping by nearly 70% compared to 1918, while Japanese medical officers lamented their inability to even find clean needles. U.S. Army Medical Department Statistical Review, 1945. The enemy noticed. Intercepted Japanese communications from late 1944 reveal astonishment at the survival of American troops. One dramatized composite message from a Japanese regimental surgeon reads, "Our bullets and shells tear them apart, but within days they return to the line. It is as if their bodies are made anew by some secret power." To commanders steeped in Bushido, the explanation seemed supernatural. To the Americans, it was science, logistics, and industry in harmony. Yet technology alone could not carry the day. It required doctrine and discipline. The U.S. Army and Navy trained tens of thousands of medics, corpsmen, and nurses in field techniques. Manuals instructed them on how to treat shock, dress wounds under fire, and administer morphine without overdose. The Bureau of Medicine and Surgery ensured that even small landing craft carried plasma units and morphine kits. The Japanese, by contrast, often relied on hastily trained orderlies. With many frontline units going days without proper medical attention, Bureau of Medicine and Surgery Training Report, 1943. The climax of this hidden advantage came during the Battle of Iwo Jima in February 1945. On February 19th, as Marines stormed the beaches under withering fire, casualty rates soared. Nearly 2,500 Marines were killed or wounded on the first day alone. Yet within hours, Navy corpsmen dragged the wounded into makeshift aid stations dug into volcanic ash. Plasma was administered under fire, and morphine was injected even as Japanese snipers targeted medics. Over the course of the battle, 6,821 Americans were killed and 19,217 wounded. Thanks to advanced medicine, more than 90% of those wounded survived. U.S. Marine Corps Medical Report. Iwo Jima, 1945. For the Japanese garrison, cut off and undersupplied, the contrast was cruel. Their wounded lay untreated in caves, infections spreading unchecked, pain unrelieved. Captured nurses described watching men die not from bullets, but from abscesses and fever. When they later saw American medics bring even enemy prisoners back from the brink, the humiliation cut deep. To them, it proved that America not only wielded superior firepower, but also superior humanity, backed by an industrial machine that could heal as well as it killed. In every theater, the pattern repeated. At Normandy, plasma kept paratroopers alive after the chaos of June 6th. At Anzio, penicillin reduced deaths from infected shrapnel wounds. In the jungles of Burma, portable surgical units turned malaria wards into functioning hospitals. Everywhere the U.S. went, its medicine traveled with it. On jeeps, in cargo planes, aboard hospital ships like the USS Comfort. This mobility astonished the Japanese, who had no equivalent capacity to project medical power alongside combat power. Bureau of Ships Report. 1944. But to the Japanese nurses who witnessed it, the experience was destabilizing. Their training had emphasized endurance, sacrifice, and the inevitability of death for the emperor's soldiers. Now they saw Americans defy that inevitability with science. One nurse, interrogated in September 1945, admitted, "We thought victory came only through spirit. But they had a weapon we could not see, a weapon that made men rise from the dead." U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey. Nurse interrogation, 1946. By the end of the war, the evidence was undeniable. American survival rates dwarfed those of Japan. A U.S. soldier with a bullet wound to the abdomen had a 50% chance of survival by 1945. A Japanese soldier with the same wound had less than 10%. It was a gulf not of courage but of science, production, and philosophy. And yet, the greatest shock remained not in statistics but in practice. Japanese nurses could not comprehend why the Americans extended these miracles to prisoners, men their own command would have abandoned. To the Americans, it was a matter of discipline and international law. To the Japanese, it was disorienting proof of an enemy that fought with rifles in one hand and medicine in the other. What they did not yet grasp was how this medical supremacy would ripple beyond individual lives saved, how it would shape campaigns, morale, and even the psychological collapse of Japanese resistance. That story, the strategic and emotional legacy of America's medical weapon, was only beginning to unfold by the time the guns fell silent in August 1945. The hidden power of American medicine had already reshaped the battlefield in ways that went beyond statistics. It had not merely saved lives. It had altered morale, broken enemy faith, and laid the foundation for a new kind of warfare where logistics and science could prove as decisive as tanks or aircraft. For American soldiers, the knowledge that morphine, plasma, and penicillin were never far away gave them a resilience their enemies could not fathom. For Japanese troops and nurses, the realization was devastating. Their empire could not only be outgunned and outproduced. It could be out-healed. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey. 1946. The impact stretched far beyond Okinawa and Iwo Jima. Across the Pacific, American survival rates soared. By 1945, a wounded U.S. soldier stood a nearly 90% chance of survival if evacuated to a field hospital within hours. By contrast, Japanese soldiers without antibiotics or blood transfusions succumbed to infections that American medicine routinely defeated. The difference was not lost on the enemy. Japanese interrogations after the war reveal repeated references to the immortality of U.S. troops. A bitter nickname born of frustration as soldiers returned to the line days after being riddled with shrapnel. Japanese POW interrogation. Manila, 1945. But the psychological weight of American medicine was even greater than its tactical value. To Japanese nurses trained in the doctrine of sacrifice, the sight of Americans treating enemy prisoners cut deeper than defeat in battle. It eroded faith in the imperial system, exposing the limits of a culture that worshipped death while the enemy seemed to worship life. One nurse later confessed, "Our emperor told us life was cheap. Their generals told them life was precious. Who was stronger in the end?" Captured nurse testimony, Tokyo, 1946. In practical terms, this doctrine of preservation sustained entire campaigns. The island-hopping strategy of Admiral Nimitz and General MacArthur depended on maintaining combat strength through relentless battles in unfamiliar climates. Without rapid evacuation chains, hospital ships, and portable surgical teams, casualties would have gutted divisions before they could seize airfields or ports. Instead, medics stabilized the wounded on beaches, evacuated them to LSTs outfitted as floating wards, and then transferred them to vast hospitals in Guam or Hawaii. From there, survivors often returned to duty, fueling an endless cycle of manpower Japan could not match. U.S. Navy Bureau of Medicine report. 1945. Behind every successful evacuation lay engineering brilliance and industrial muscle. The C-47 Skytran, adapted as a flying ambulance, ferried casualties out of combat zones by the thousands. The USS Benevolence, a 15,000-ton hospital ship, carried operating theaters more advanced than many civilian hospitals of the time. Companies like Johnson & Johnson mass-produced sterile bandages by the ton, while refrigeration trucks kept plasma cool even in tropical jungles. These were not luxuries. They were weapons of endurance. To Japanese nurses watching from the other side, the scale was incomprehensible. Their empire, starved by blockade and bombings, could not keep its own soldiers alive, let alone treat its prisoners. War Production Board report. 1945. The human element, however, cannot be ignored. It was not only science and machines, but also the discipline and compassion of tens of thousands of medics, nurses, and surgeons. These were men and women who carried stretchers under fire, who sterilized scalpels in foxholes, and who refused to distinguish between friend and foe when life hung by a thread. Their courage infused the doctrine of mercy with flesh and blood. For veterans who returned home, memories of being pulled from the mud and given morphine or plasma remained as powerful as memories of combat itself. U.S. Veterans Oral History Collection. 1947. The Japanese response was a mix of awe and despair. POW interrogations reveal that many prisoners initially refused treatment, convinced it was a trick. When penicillin cleared infections that should have killed them, disbelief turned to silence. Japanese nurses later admitted that these experiences sowed doubts about the empire's claim of moral superiority. As one nurse wrote in her diary, "We despised them for their machines. We feared them for their firepower. But in the end, what shamed us most was their mercy." Captured nurse diary, 1945. Strategically, the advantage of medicine rippled into morale. For American troops, the promise of rescue and treatment emboldened them to press attacks that might otherwise have faltered. For the Japanese, the knowledge that their wounded were doomed sapped willpower. Soldiers facing bayonets could fight on. Soldiers facing disease and infection often surrendered to despair long before the final bullet was fired. Medicine, in this sense, became psychological warfare, an invisible force that crushed resistance without firing a shot. U.S. Psychological Warfare Division report. 1945. The legacy extended into the post-war world. In the Korean War, MASH units carried forward the lessons of Leyte and Okinawa, saving lives under conditions even more challenging. In Vietnam, helicopter medevacs delivered the wounded to hospitals within the golden hour, a concept born in the Pacific. By the Gulf War, mobile surgical teams operated with precision that echoed the pioneering tints of 1945. Today, in modern conflicts, networked evacuation systems, advanced antibiotics, and battlefield trauma kits trace their lineage directly to the breakthroughs that astonished Japanese nurses 8 decades ago. Department of Defense Medical History. 1991. The moral dimension also endured. America's decision to extend medical care even to its enemies influenced the Geneva Conventions of 1949, codifying protections for prisoners of war. In classrooms and training manuals, medics were taught that saving lives, friend or foe, was not an act of charity but a weapon of discipline, a way to uphold the values that distinguished one army from another. Japanese testimonies after the war often cited this as the most incomprehensible aspect of the conflict. "We expected cruelty," one captured surgeon remarked. "Instead, we saw them heal even us." It broke something inside. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, Medical Interrogations, 1946. And yet, behind this triumph lay sacrifice. Thousands of American medical personnel died dragging wounded men to safety. Nurses endured bombardments and disease. Engineers worked without pause to perfect plasma storage or penicillin yields. The quiet labor of scientists, factory workers, and medics built a weapon as vital as any rifle, a weapon of survival. Their names rarely appear in battlefield reports, yet without them, the American soldier would have been as vulnerable to infection as his Japanese counterpart. The unsung heroes of laboratories and assembly lines were as decisive as generals and admirals, War Production Board records. 1945. The closing months of the war brought the contrast into sharpest relief. In August 1945, as Japan surrendered, hundreds of thousands of prisoners, American, British, Dutch, and even Japanese, were liberated from camps. Many survived only because American medicine kept them alive through the final weeks. Plasma infusions, antibiotics for dysentery, and surgical care for neglected wounds. For Japanese nurses who saw this, the shame was inescapable. Their empire, which promised divine protection, had failed to preserve its own. Their enemies, whom they had been taught to despise, had done what they could not. Looking back, historians agree that medicine was one of the silent weapons of the Second World War. It did not thunder like artillery or soar like bombers, but it shaped outcomes nonetheless. It sustained armies, undermined enemies, and carved into memory the image of Americans healing even those who sought their destruction. In the end, the story of Japanese nurses witnessing American mercy is not only a tale of cultural shock, it is a parable of modern war itself. The empire that exalted sacrifice was undone by a nation that exalted survival. The lesson endures. In an age where firepower grows ever deadlier, it is often the quiet instruments of healing that secure victory. One American medic wrote in a bloodstained diary on Okinawa, reflecting on the sight of enemy and ally alike under his care. Dramatized, "I don't choose who lives. I only choose to fight for life." Maybe that's the real difference between us and them. And so the war closed with a truth etched not only in ruins and graves, but in bandages and plasma bottles. In modern warfare, compassion is not weakness but strength, and the power to heal can break armies as surely as the power to kill.